Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the latest businessdesk.com webinar in partnership with Squire Patton Boggs. I'm Ben Ormsby and I'm the Yorkshire editor. Today's theme is on reviving the Northern Powerhouse economy and unlocking the lockdown. Ahead of the COVID-19 pandemic, the northern cities and economies were enjoying a renaissance, and since then, suggestions are that the biggest economic impact will be felt in the north. So this seminar aims to look to cover the current view from Westminster, how city economies have been affected across the north, what they're doing in the short and long term, and looking at the opportunities the crisis brings to perhaps rebuild those economies, but also the financial risks and considerations we all need to consider as we enter a new phase of battle with the disease. So today I'm pleased to be joined by an expert panel, which includes the former Northern Powerhouse Minister and Senior Advisor in Squire Patton Boggs' European Public Policy Practice, James Wharton. Roodhouse, the Chief Officer of Economic Development at Leeds City Council. The Director of Cities Advisory at Arup, Tom Bridges. And John Alderton, Leeds Office Managing Partner at Squire Patton Boggs. So the session will carry on shortly with each panellist having a chance to speak and share their thoughts and topics, followed by a Q&A session at the end. If during the discussion you have a question you would like to be considered, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we will get to it at the end. So let's start, James, with the view from Westminster, if you don't mind, please.
Great. Well, thank you, Ben, and thank you, everybody, for tuning in. I think it's slightly depressing when I think back to the whole thrust and purpose of Northern Powerhouse to hear yet again that the recession may well or is expected to hit the north hardest. It seems to be that that's what we're trying to get away from, trying to diversify and build depth in the northern economy. But nonetheless, it has been the case before. It looks like it might be the case again. What is happening in the politics? Well, actually, I think at the risk of starting on a controversial note, I think the heyday of the Northern Powerhouse was really as a brand, as a specific brand itself, rather than as a focus on the north and the economy, was when George Osborne was Chancellor and was really leading the charge as effectively a Northern MP himself, as a very powerful Chancellor. And when we think back to the politics of that time, it's sometimes difficult to imagine the parallel world and universe in which we found ourselves. We were supposed to have just had the 2020 general election, probably with David Cameron having finished another term in office, handing over to George Osborne, and George Osborne going up against Jeremy Corbyn. Jeremy Corbyn, of course, facing his first general election that year. Instead, we've had a couple of general elections. We've had the European referendum. We've had all of the chaos and the challenges that recent years have brought us. One of the things that has come with that has been a move away, I think, from the Northern Powerhouse as a brand, not necessarily as a concept, but as a brand. You can see that although Grant Shapps is technically the Northern Powerhouse Minister, it no longer has quite the same level of investment in politics terms as it perhaps did before. And I think that started as soon as George Osborne himself left. I think you can see in the Theresa May, early days of the Theresa May administration, I finished being Northern Powerhouse Minister after about a year. When Theresa May came in, she moved me to international development, a job which I enjoyed and for which I am grateful. But she also then, her administration refused to say the word Northern Powerhouse or words Northern Powerhouse for a couple of weeks. And Andrew Percy, who was my successor, the MP for Brigham Goole, became quite frustrated by that. There were internal debates about it. And eventually it was clear that the brand was back and Northern Powerhouse was still there. But I think since then, it has continued through Jake Berry, who did a very good and valiant job and for the first time sat in cabinet. It's now been passed over to Grant Shapps. I think actually it's been superseded by what they're calling the levelling up agenda, which has many of the same opportunities for the North in it and for the Northern economy, but it doesn't have that singular focus on the North, if you can have such a thing, which I think does present some potential challenges. So what might happen now? Well, everything has been clearly disrupted by the impact of coronavirus, whether it's our private businesses and private lives, our work lives, or the functioning of politics in this country. And we don't yet know what the fallout of that is really going to look like. If I were to speculate, I would think that the biggest challenge clearly going to be the money and the economy. So we don't know how long the current crisis will last for, in what form it will be lifted, but it will be lifted to some extent. We may not go back entirely to normal for a long time, but we can see already the government is trying to move to get the economy going again. You can see that in some of the announcements on Sunday from the Prime Minister. For example, getting the housing market moving insofar as they can by allowing visits for house sales and house sales to start to take place again. That is happening not because the virus is entirely beaten, although clearly it is subdued. It's happening because I think there is increasing concern in government about the economic impact and the long-term implications of that economic impact of the steps that have been taken so far. Necessary though they may be, and people can argue and debate the quality of the measures that have been put in place and the reaction that the government has implemented to coronavirus, it is undeniable there's going to be a very serious economic impact. It is undeniable that national debt is going to increase quite dramatically, somewhere in the region of 300 billion. What that means is there's going to be less money freely available. Now, we can easily forget that actually there was quite a reasonable amount of headroom in the budget. The government was already setting out on a path to spending more money, which I think was welcomed by some, not by others, for political reasons, but nonetheless was definitely their direction of travel. Well, now there is going to be much less headroom. In fact, we're in negative headroom territory when it comes to the previous budget, quite significantly. And there's going to be a real need to get a grip of the public finances. The impression I get listening to the political debate and talking to some of the political figures involved in that discussion, from whom I try to winkle out what bits of information I can, and of course looking at the media coverage, is several-fold. We're going to see, I think, a range of measures to address the financial challenges, which will likely include tax rises, spending restraint, and so on. But I think we're also going to see a continued desire by the government to invest in big projects, in infrastructure, in things that grow the economy. And there is, they say every cloud has a silver lining. Well, if there's a silver lining to what's happening now, there's an opportunity to almost reset some parts of the economy and to really push an agenda of investment. And when we rebuild what comes afterwards and we find the economic growth of the future, to channel that into new industries, into new businesses, and geographically into new areas. And that represents opportunities for the north of England, for the Northern Powerhouse project as was, and for many of those economies that the people on this call today care about, the communities that they care about. And I think the political will is there. It's not necessarily in the same guise as it once was. And a lot of the work that George Osborne wanted to do, although people argue about the amount of investment that flowed, the establishing of transport for the north, the getting established devolution across much of the north of England, and the metro mayors and the budgets that come with them, the foundation stones are there. The challenge across the Northern Powerhouse now, in my opinion, will be to make the case for the investment that the north needs in a way that is likely to be successful and is likely to be well received by the government of the day. And the government of the day, I think, will be interested in big infrastructure, interested in economic return, interested in developing the new economy of the future, post-COVID, post-Brexit, post whatever our relationship with China is going to look like. What does the economy of this country look like, and where can the North contribute? It most certainly, of course, can contribute significantly to that. The flip side and the danger is that the specific messages that are appealing, those messages that we should invest in transport between Manchester and Leeds, that old chestnut, because it will unlock growth in the future that this country will need, can be lost amongst a general push for more spending across the board. And I see this already. There are voices who will use the Northern Powerhouse brand or agenda insofar as they can, will use any space that they can occupy to make the case for what they want to see invested in. And investment in almost anything is generally a good thing, but it has to be paid for, and there's going to be a limited, and even more limited pot available in the future. And therefore, I think if there's one thing politically that we need to do, those of us who care about the economies of the north of England, it is to be judicious in the things that we complain about and judicious in the things that we ask for. Because every time the Northern Powerhouse gets used to complain about something that isn't actually to do with the northern economy, the north gets less spent per head on X, Y, or Z. If it's not about growing the economy or the infrastructure that's needed, however valid the point might be, it actually dilutes the message which should be a broadly positive one about what the North can contribute, and an economically focused one, not because the other arguments about salary levels or investment in school buildings or whatever it might be don't matter, of course they do, but because the space that is occupied by the Northern Powerhouse should be economically focused. And I think that that's going to be the challenge, but the opportunity is there. The political environment is such that there will be some spending. Boris Johnson, who I have the fortune to know quite well, and is a fascinating character as Prime Minister. He believes in big things. He likes to be able to point at a big project and say, we're doing that. You look at the Olympics that he delivered when he was Mayor of London as an example. He was never happier when doing that project. Look at Crossrail, which he strongly advocated for when he was in London. You know, he understands city economies and thinks and can think in the terms of the metropolitan areas that surround them, those agglomerated economies. He understands that you can drive a lot of that with good local leadership because he's been involved in that directly in his career and political life. He wants a legacy as Prime Minister for however long he holds office. And part of that is clearly going to be investment in economy changing, step changing things, infrastructure, whether it's broadband, rail, or whatever it might be. And there is a real opportunity, I think, for the north of England to make its case within that space, but we have to be judicious about the things on which we choose to pick our fights and make our arguments.
Thank you very much, James. That's really insightful. Eve, I'd like to bring you in because obviously we can't look at the future without looking at the important role that local government organisations have played during this whole situation. Not only the crucial work they've done sort of with health and social care, but also looking at the economies and the future concerns and what's been affected. So how have northern city economies been affected so far?
Thank you very much, Ben. So first of all, just briefly to let people know a little bit more about my role, for those people that maybe haven't met me before. I lead on economic development at Leeds City Council. So before COVID, or BC as we refer to it sometimes at the council, I had a very wide remit which covered everything from international relations and promotion of Leeds as a tourism destination through to inward investment, business support and the delivery of our economic growth strategy. During the emergency response, I've taken the lead on the business and economy response and now also beginning to think about recovery. So just to give you that context by way of introduction before I move into my remarks. So Ben gave me the broad topic of how has the northern economy been affected by COVID-19. And so I thought I'd start really by just reflecting a little bit on some of the analysis and then move more a bit into experience. So it's really clear and quite sobering that the impact on the economy is going to be significant and that we'll be facing challenges that many of us have never experienced before in our working lives in terms of moving into recovering from this. If you look at the forecasts from the OBR and from the Bank of England, they're both indicating significant drops in GDP in the next quarter, 35% and 25% respectively, and a significant increase in unemployment. The Bank of England forecasting 9% increase last week. But how will this play out for the people, places and productivity of the UK? If you look at some of the analysis on that's been done by the Resolution Foundation and by the Centre for Progressive Policy, what it begins to show is that the economic shocks are not evenly distributed. So from a sectoral point of view, you obviously have some sectors that are much more heavily hit, like accommodation and food services. And you know, in Leeds, that's very apparent because we only have of our hotels 7 open, serving key workers with an occupancy rate of around 20%. But the geographical impact is likely to be variable as well. The Centre for Progressive Policy did a piece of work looking at the impact by local authority area, and none of the authority areas that would be hardest hit in the 20 that they identified were in London or the South East. But they did suggest that actually the Midlands might be harder hit than the North, given its dependence on an exposure to the automotive industry. So we need to be sort of cautious about assuming that actually necessarily the North is going to feel this more than every other part of the the country. And so to the points that were made earlier about being judicious about what we argue for, I think it needs to be in the context of our needs and our nuances regionally. Moving away from the analysis, how does this feel on the ground? So if I take people first, we've seen a significant drop-off in jobs being advertised across our region, although there are still opportunities in areas like health and social care, and we've helped a number of people into jobs in those areas, but also some areas of retail like food, we have been able to help people move into jobs where there has been demand, for example, working for Asda across Leeds. We've seen a significant increase in poverty. So we've got families that are reliant on services that we've put in place specifically for COVID-19 that we think we will need to continue as a local government, because people are really, if we pull those services away, the impact will be really significant. And only this morning on Twitter, I was reading from one of the charities working in Leeds around the desperation levels of some of the people that are accessing those services increasing. Although vulnerable children can still attend school, they've not been attending at the levels that we would expect. And so we anticipate that there's a potential long-term impact on attainment levels and how we can ensure that we continue the progress in that area, making sure that our young people have got the skills that they need to be active in the economy in the future. Moving into place and offering a few reflections there. We've seen an emptying out of our city centre with an expectation that we're going to have to work hard to get people to return with confidence when we're able to support people to do that. We don't expect retail to come back in the way that it was before. We've seen major national trade chains disappear or announce that they're going to be doing significant restructuring. And so we're going to have to really focus on the re-energising of our district centres as well, not just looking at our city centre. We have seen a really positive switch to walking and cycling, and we're looking to capitalise on that as other cities are across the north, but also across the country, with changes being made to widening cycle lanes and footpaths. And some of you will have seen announcements around that both regionally and nationally. And we're also continuing with our long-term plans. So we haven't lost sight of the importance to carry on with connecting Leeds, which is our local plan around transport development. And I think it's critical that local authorities don't lose sight of those projects and continue with those, as well as taking the opportunity to innovate and respond to the circumstances we're in. Then thinking about productivity. So one of the interesting things is that we've seen the adoption of digital at real pace. So whether it was large-scale purchase of laptops in early March, when it was a number of businesses were struggling to get the kit, then we've also seen a high demand through our business support service for some of the services which provide advice and products to adopt digital technologies, which is a really positive thing. The digital sector itself has been impacted by COVID-19, but it's holding up really well. And in Leeds, we're still able to have our virtual digital festival, which was a huge success. We've seen increasing engagement from early stage businesses with our adventure programme, which is for businesses 3 years and younger, which is kind of counterintuitive, but is the case. And we've seen some really innovative businesses in Leeds doing really well. So for example, Vet AI, which is based at Nexus, the innovation hub at the University of Leeds, they provide online veterinary services, and they've just seen a real kind of spike in demand. And also another company, as an example, is Surface Skins, also based in Leeds. They've developed a revolutionary self-sanitizing door push and door handle, so you can understand why they've also experienced a real kind of increase in demand. So COVID-19 has and will kind of expose the underlying issues in our economy, but also the opportunities. And if anything, what we've really seen is kind of an acceleration of the trends that were already there. But I agree with James that this is an opportunity for us. The Chancellor yesterday kind of stated that the ambition remains to level up. However, that task probably just became a lot more challenging in terms of the implications that we've got. And so my first thoughts around that, which I'm not going to steal Tom's thunder, who's going to talk about recovery, is that if anything, we need to collaborate more than ever across our cities and across the region and across the north as a whole, to make sure that we can really more than ever kind of take those opportunities to get the economy structured in the right way, and to move forwards positively. So hopefully that's a kind of good contextual start for you.
That was perfect. Thank you very much. Which does lead nicely onto Tom. Tom, I know you've sort of written fairly recently about the 7 steps for rebuilding UK city and local economies in the wake of the current crisis. And obviously there isn't going to be any silver bullet, but how do you see opportunities for cities and economies coming out of this?
Okay, thanks, Ben, and Eve. Thank you for that really comprehensive and albeit slightly sobering analysis of the economic impacts. I'm sure everyone who's listening will join me in thanking you, Eve, and your team at Leeds City Council, and indeed your counterparts in other local authorities, for the fantastic work you've been doing in supporting businesses in the immediate response to the COVID-19 crisis. I think at times like this, local government is very much the fourth emergency service and has really stepped up and is playing an absolutely critical role in helping the government distribute the significant financial support that is much needed for many businesses and many people. However, I think now is the time to be looking ahead and looking to what the recovery plan needs to look like for towns, cities, and the Northern Powerhouse. And I think that's important because that will give confidence to businesses and confidence to people. As James said, I think this crisis potentially questions some of the foundations for things like the Northern Powerhouse project, and indeed questions some of the sort of foundations for recent economic growth, particularly around high densities of jobs in city centres, and I'll come back to that. So what can we do? What can places do? What can local authorities do? What can local enterprise partnerships do? And how can businesses work with them? Well, first, in the short to medium term, we need to get people back into town. We need to open up our town and city centres in a way that is safe whilst maintaining physical distancing. We need to prepare our places for the test, trace, isolate phase that we're now going to be entering into, and that does mean measures like retrofitting wider pavements, more cycle routes. It requires us to think about the transport system in a very different way. It needs to require us to think about how we occupy and manage our buildings, our offices, and our city spaces. And I think that's going to be a huge effort, and is going to require some really rapid sort of innovation from those of us involved in the design, the planning, and operation of urban spaces. But I think that will be important. I think secondly, as James said, we need to have our shovel-ready projects ready to go as part of an economic stimulus package. So yes, we want to focus on on some of the big long-term schemes like HS2 or Northern Powerhouse Rail. But Eve mentioned things like the Connecting Leeds programme, a package of smaller scale transport interventions, new railway stations such as the ones at White Rose Office Park, so some of the local improvements around Leeds South Bank, for example. And I think that package of those regeneration and infrastructure projects is really important to kickstart the economy and to indeed keep things moving in the interim as well. So it's really important, I think, that the public sector sort of keep those projects moving at the current time and get them ready to go as we come out of this. I think thirdly, as Eve has mentioned, this crisis is going to have a big shakeout in the labour market, and there needs to be a huge effort around helping people access the skills and the job opportunities that they will need. Lots of people will be losing their jobs. I think we face the prospect of very significant youth unemployment and graduate unemployment or underemployment. And Eve has talked about, actually, the analysis shows that it's some of the lower skilled, lower paid people who are most vulnerable here. So a real focus on how we reskill people, how we upskill people, and how we connect them to jobs in the future, I think will be important. And I think we should reflect on the sort of jobs that we want to create. And I think this crisis has led us to, think about workers in industries such as health and social care, such as supermarkets and retail and transport in a different way. And I think we need to think about how we value and how we pay and how we reward people who are working in those industries, and think about not just creating jobs, but sort of creating good quality jobs to help, and how we help people not just get into work, but how to progress within their career into better paid, more secure jobs. So I think the labour market and skills is going to be a big area for focus. I think next we need to think about the implications for the high street and our town centres. As Eva said, this what's happened over the last few weeks has accelerated the shift to online services, and that shift was already happening as we move from bricks to clicks in retail. That will be accelerated, and we now need to really reimagine the roles of our town centres and our high street. There may be a case for meanwhile users. We may need to think about them as residential locations, but that's going to, I think, require some quite radical thinking. I think government initiatives such as the Future High Streets Fund, the Strongest Towns Fund will have an important role to play there. I think next, there's a real opportunity for us to put in the building blocks for a more innovative and entrepreneurial economy in the future. Rapid innovation is the order of the day. James talked about, actually, what does that future post-Brexit, post-COVID economy look like? I think what we're seeing at the moment is the way businesses are pivoting, the way public services are pivoting, the focus on some of the key societal challenges. I think there's a real opportunity to capture some of that and to put in place an economy and the right ecosystems between large and small businesses, between the private sector, universities, public services, investors, that is more successful at commercializing innovation, commercializing research and development, and creating the new products and processes and high growth scale up businesses that the UK is going to need to be competitive in the future. And we can use this as an opportunity. You know, we can use our cities as test beds, whether it's trialing things like new drone deliveries or the use of information and data to solve problems. I think there's real opportunities here. I think finally, I just wanted to say a few words about what are the implications for cities, what are the implications for the Northern Powerhouse project, because I think some people are actually questioning if we can all work from home, enabled by Zoom, do we need to travel into cities? Do we need to be able to travel between the places in the north? Will we need expensive office space and high densities of face-to-face contact in our urban places? I happen to believe that once we're through this crisis, our cities will come back with a vengeance. I think the shift to a knowledge economy that's based on intangibles such as creativity, such as software, such as data, and ideas means that face-to-face contact has become more, not less important in the modern world. People want to collaborate, they want to compare, they want to compete with other skilled people within their offices and within the hyper-caffeinated spaces between the buildings. And smart people want to work alongside other smart people. And so I think the role of our officers, the role of our city centres may change. It may be less as a providing lots of desks and more as providing places for collaboration and innovation. But there is an important role for commercial space and for public space in our cities. And it will be really important that the transport network connects those places up well so that people can move job without moving house, and firms can access a skilled and creative workforce across a wide area. So we've been able to retrofit our cities in the past to respond to health crises. I think we can do so in the future, and I think cities will be back.
That's a nice positive note to end that discussion on. I guess this leads me on to you, John, that obviously financial and risk considerations that businesses need to have as we enter this whole new phase of exiting lockdown and coming out of it. Would you be able to sort of explain a few of things you think that people need to be aware of as we enter this new phase?
Yes, certainly, Ben. Good morning. As my fellow speakers have already highlighted, I think unlocking is going to be far harder than the lockdown. We've seen a paradigm shift in many parts of our business and personal lives over the last 2 or 3 months as the COVID pandemic has impacted all of us. In many ways, things will never be the same again, or at least it's going to take several months and possibly even years to return to what we may have seen as a degree of normality. So how should businesses in the North plan to unlock, and what are the financial and risk considerations that they need to take into account as they do so? So first of all, I'll start by looking at people, and by that I mean people as employees, as suppliers, and as customers. Vast numbers of employees have been furloughed, and that of itself presents a challenge in terms of getting those people back into work. We know from the Chancellor's announcements yesterday that the current furlough arrangements are going to remain in place until the end of July, but there's then going to be a tapering of those arrangements to the end of October. Unfortunately, I think redundancies are going to be inevitable, and many employers are going to have to start thinking about consultation with those employees because of the sheer numbers that could be made redundant 45 days before the furloughing starts to unwind and the tapering starts to come in. We talk about people. People are also extremely concerned, as the other speakers have highlighted, about safety and security, and health and safety has been at the heart of everything so far in looking at our reactions to COVID, and quite rightly so. It's been a key focus in the government's messaging, and it's a key focus for most businesses who are currently continuing to trade and operate, or as they start to think about what unlocking looks like. I think it's absolutely clear that social distancing is here to stay. We're going to see increasing requirements for people to wear face masks, as the government indicated yesterday. It's now going to be encouraged in England in confined public spaces. People are going to be expected to have their temperatures taken, perhaps when going into shops, when going into offices, on logging in, clocking in into their work environments. And tracing apps are going to increasingly become part of our day-to-day lives, as people are expected to be able to be identified if they have picked up the virus, and to track and trace the people who they've been connected with. All of this is about restoring confidence that a business is a safe place for its employees, a safe place for its visitors, for its customers, for its suppliers who are delivering to it. And then talking about people as consumers. We've got vast uncertainty within our economy at the moment. I think it's inevitable, as the Bank of England has indicated, that recession is here, that we're going to be in a short, sharp, deep recession. How we come out of that, I think, is partly in our own control, partly in the control of government, and partly outside our control in terms of the global economy. But with that recession, we're going to see job losses. We're already seeing people's changing priorities in terms of the way in which people want to interact with each other, with businesses. Many people are going to have less money to spend. They're going to be more cautious about how they spend that money. So the consumers who drive much of the economy are going to be at the heart of our recovery, and how businesses react to and meet and exceed those consumers' expectations is going to be key to the success of the recovery for many businesses. So moving on from people, I'd like to just talk about planning. Planning is absolutely key. The planning for coming out of lockdown is going to be the key to whether a business is successful or not, and how successful it is as it comes out. The government's provided over the last couple of days some guidance around the various types of workplace, with reports issued on the 11th of May, looking at different environments such as office environments, people working from vehicles, people working on construction sites. And so it's clear, in looking at the planning for your for unlocking your business, you need to develop a bespoke plan. You need to be looking at what the government guidance is, because that's setting a norm. You need to be considering in detail the health and safety requirements for your particular business, and every business will be slightly different in terms of how it operates, how it needs to operate. If you haven't already started planning to come out of lockdown, you should be doing so now. There'll also be key issues around the sectors in terms of the timing for the sectors. This has already been indicated in the announcements from the Prime Minister at the weekend. Certain sectors are going to be able to start to unlock more quickly. But when we start looking at some of the higher density, things like football grounds, things like cinemas, those sort of places, restaurants, bars, we're looking at a longer term lockdown, and it's probably at the very least July before some of those can start to reopen. And then, that's on a very limited basis. So your workplace issues are going to vary, and they may vary within your business. The difference between the building site that part of your business runs from and the office that the other part runs from is going to need different requirements. The difference of reopening a cinema is going to be materially different to reopening a factory. There will be some common trends and requirements, but every plan needs to be bespoke. It's going to be valid to look at European comparisons. If part of your business has an overseas operation that's ahead of us in the COVID curve, how are they unlocking? What are they doing? Certainly in Italy, Ferrari are held out as the leading model for the procedures they put in place around unlocking. But you can look in other countries, Germany, Spain, France, all ahead of us in relation to the curve, and all delivering unlocking in their own ways. And I'm sure the UK government will take heed of some of those measures, some that work, perhaps some that don't. So every business in planning needs to maintain adaptable, flexible, because some of the requirements are going to change. We've seen that with furloughing. I think there have been 7 different iterations of the guidance around that. So you've got to be nimble to be able to deal with that. In terms of your planning, the people are a key part of that planning. What are the working hours that those people are going to work? People are going to be encouraged to try and have a phased return to work, to change shift patterns so that we take the pressure off the transport systems. Are you going to require those people to wear face masks? Are you going to require them to have their temperatures taken on arrival at work? How are they going to get to work? As Eve highlighted, the cities and the local authorities and the government are encouraging far more people to walk, to cycle. Is your business set up to allow those people, when they get to work, somewhere to park their bike, to make sure that those are safe and secure? Are these changes going to require changes to employment contracts? You're going to need to make sure that those are properly implemented, or we're going to have a series of employment tribunal claims as employees feel that they're not being treated properly. So how many people are you going to need? When are you going to need them? All of that needs to go into your planning. Turning to your supply chain, how robust was that going into lockdown? Many businesses we've spoken to relied heavily on Chinese imports for significant parts of their supply, and the disruption there was material. So I think a lot of businesses, and particularly in the north, have looked at localizing their supply chain, which is fantastic in terms of strengthening the northern economy. But again, you need to be testing how robust your supply chain is as you unlock. Are your suppliers unlocking at the same pace you are? That's going to be a key consideration. So businesses in planning, plan for change, be flexible, be nimble. As a firm, Squire Patton Boggs has launched an unlocking assessment tool, which takes about 10 minutes to complete online. We'll come back to you within 48 hours and give you a gap analysis. And then over time, we'll share data comparisons with other peer group companies so you can check where you are in that unlocking curve. Communication is key. Communication with your employees, communication with your suppliers, communication with your customers. Let them know what you're doing. Some of the government requirements now are going to be the assessments that you've carried out as to the safety and the procedures in place go on your company's website. Those are significant measures that put things in the public domain. And finally, don't forget the B word, Brexit. Certainly at the moment is still here. The transition period ends on 31st December. So with everything else we've got to do, we've still got to plan for that. Places, as Tom talked about, the workplace is never going to be the same again. The increase in home working, the move to digital and online from a retail point of view, the obvious winners at the moment in the economy, the likes of Uber Eats, Deliveroo, Amazon, Zoom that we're using this morning, Ocado, those are businesses that are able to adapt and deal with the changed environment we've got. It's changing expectations. The number of people who are now thinking more about protecting the environment, encouraging people to walk and cycle. We've given our planet a chance to recover through this terrible time, and that's a massive benefit. People will want to travel less. The meetings will take place by Zoom, by Teams. Those are things that you need to think about as your business unlocks. How are you going to make sure that your business is fit for that? There's going to be massive concerns about commuting, particularly where it's perhaps less of an issue in Leeds and Manchester, where there isn't the same density of public transport requirements as, say, in London, but it's still going to be significant concerns. And then, of course, many premises are let, and there's a positive tension between landlords and tenants at the moment. Many tenants seeking to defer or get rent holidays, but those won't stay forever, and those are going to come back on soon. And then finally, paying for coming out of lockdown. How did your business pay to get into lockdown? In many cases, you've had the benefit of furloughing and grants, but a lot of businesses have had to take on extra finance, the government-backed schemes, deferring your rent, deferring the VAT, times to pay for VAT and PAYE. All those are kicking the can down the road. They're all going to have to be paid for. The cost of the additional health and safety requirements you're putting in place, the cost of the phased reopening of your businesses, risks of supplier and customer insolvency, risks of your suppliers and customers changing their terms, suppliers wanting payment on delivery, and customers wanting to extend credit. All of that needs factoring in to your cash flows, into your forecasts. And just finally, there are some new restructuring tools which the government is likely to introduce over the next week to 10 days. We're expecting the legislation in draft on Monday, which will perhaps give some businesses a respite and an ability to seek a moratorium from their creditors whilst they go through a restructuring to come out of the COVID period, fitter and stronger than they were before. So with that, I'll hand back to Ben, and we'll have a look at the questions you've all been sending in.
Thank you, John. So yeah, we've had a selection of questions, so we'll just bring the panel all back into view, and we'll start with Well, the first one that got a few mentions was revolving everyone's favourite topic of HS2. Is now the time to cancel HS2? You know, and would there be better ways to spend that money on smaller, local, more targeted projects? Does anyone want to go first on that?
I'm happy to address that. But maybe go on, Eve, you go first. Give a proper economics view rather than a political one.
Well, I was going to go short and sweet, really, which is that as you hear many of the leaders, political leaders from the North say, don't just assume that you can only spend on one project. Too often in the North, we sort of settle and say it's either or, rather than saying, actually, we wish to continue with HS2, but we also need to be working on all the other projects that are going to help us recover. So my short and sweet would be, no, we should continue with HS2, and we should continue with the other projects that we need to deliver to achieve levelling up.
James, do you want to follow?
Well, I suppose we're all Keynesians now. You know, if you have a difficult economic period, it's probably not the time to turn the spending taps off. And whether it's the long-term importance of HS2, which it's always been badly branded, is more about capacity than it is speed, of course. Whether it's the knock-on effects right down the supply chain of all the people who would have worked on that project that wouldn't then be able to if you cancelled it, or whether it's just the simple fact that quite a lot of money has now been committed to it, which could well be lost if it was cancelled. I think it's reasonably clear that the project's very, very likely to go ahead. I leave that slight bit of wriggle room because I am still a politician at heart, and you never know in the current climate. But I think the signs are that we're going to get probably more spending on big projects rather than less, and I don't see why that wouldn't apply to HS2 as well.
Ben?
Yeah, Tom?
Yeah, so I'll declare an interest. Arup are part of that supply chain. But I was just going to say two things, really. When we talk about the sort of post-Brexit, post-COVID economy that we want to build, particularly outside London, currently it takes about 2 hours to travel between Leeds and Nottingham. It's a journey of around 70 miles. It connects sort of LEP areas with a combined population. If you take Sheffield, City Region, Nottingham, Derby and Leeds and the wider region, that's around 6 million people, that's around 3 million jobs, that's around 10% of UK PLC, and the train goes at an average speed of 36 miles an hour. So I think if anyone thinks that's the sort of infrastructure we need for a competitive post-COVID, post-Brexit economy, my own view is that's just not good enough. And currently Morocco has more miles of high-speed rail than the UK. So I think we've got to invest in our infrastructure. And HS2, it's about capacity and it's about connectivity and it's about connecting cities much more than it is about speed. And I think it's essential.
So we're going on from that, I guess, at the start of this, James, you gave a bit of a view about the Northern Powerhouse, the brand and ownership of it. We had a question that is the brand not owned by the North, and therefore we need to be more vibrant and vigorous even post-COVID and make sure that we don't wait for handouts but actually get from government, but actually put forward what we want.
Yeah, I mean, I really hope so. I think it would be a real sign of success of the brand, whatever people think of the project, if the North really long-term takes ownership of it. And there are signs that could well be happening. It's still very widely in use. It's still being used to push forward a relatively united voice for much of the economies of the North of England. And that was always part of the challenge. People used to complain a lot. I remember when I took the role, one of the things you regularly heard was, X amount per head is spent in London on whatever public transport, capital infrastructure, and only Y much smaller amount is spent in the North, and isn't it a disgrace? And there are all sorts of reasons for that, including the particular pressures that London faces. But one of the reasons for that is that, why did London get Crossrail? Because they advocated for it for years and years and years. What we got from the North, we used to get, was each area advocating for its own little scheme, not necessarily in a joined up sense. The schemes not necessarily fitting together across the North in a sensible way. And they would advocate for the time that some individual had interest in it, but then move on before a decision had been made or a project secured. By giving the North of England, as it were, one voice and a structure under which a united voice can put forward proposals for projects that it likes and will benefit the whole of the economy, I think that's the route to success with any government of any colour. That's how you lobby. That's how you actually change and shift policy on these big capital expenditures. So I really hope so. I would love to see a world in which in 10 or 20 years' time, we can say, actually, look, those are the really big things that this project delivered, and it was led by the North for the North, and it's had its best impact in the North. So, I mean, let's hope so. But I do also go back to my earlier point in my introductory comments. It's important to be very focused in what is advocated for, and not to let that brand be hijacked by people who have other agendas. It should be focused on whatever the agreed economic delivery projects are for the North of England, and not used as a general stick with which to beat the government when spending in one area is lower than another, or when something bad happens to say, well, what happened to Northern Powerhouse now? It needs to be used carefully, in a focused way, in a united way, to drive long-term policy change and capital investment.
Thank you. So the other topic that has come out quite a lot heavily in the questions is the environmental impact of COVID. You all spoke about how it feels like the environment has had time to sort of start to recover. How do you balance the economic recovery with continuing the to support that the climate change agenda and keep the good work that's happened over the last 8 weeks going moving forward? John?
Yeah, Ben. I mean, I think it's going to happen naturally. It's going to take a long time for people to have confidence that they want to travel for sake of argument to London for a meeting, to get on the tube in London, when they can run that meeting virtually as effectively and far more cost effectively using Zoom. So I think we're going to get a natural easing of pressure on the environment just by what we've gone through. And I think, some things just won't come back. People will hold meetings virtually, and that will take the pressure off. People will be less inclined to travel into Leeds, Manchester every day for their job. They'll work from home 1-2 days. People will flex their travel times, and I think all of that will ease, take some of the pressure off the environment.
Thank you. And a sort of follow on from that is, and Eve, you might be able to answer this, are cities and planning systems capable and appropriately skilled to deal with these sort of the ambitions to put cycling and walking at the heart of transport policy, which obviously will help continue that move within their environment?
So I think for large authorities like Leeds, we certainly have the capability in our teams in terms of looking at these types of issues. I suppose it's the capacity really that's more the question in terms of the range of schemes that we're trying to deliver with the resources that we've got, and the financial investment into some of that. So it goes back to the question of kind of funding and what are the issues that we need to be putting into national government. And we need to consider how we're going to enter into a contract between local government and national government on recovery as well, and the financial gap that exists there if local government needs to play a really strong part in addressing some of those challenges in the city centre. And just very briefly on the previous question around environment and the climate change agenda, one of the opportunities that has arisen from this is that we've got the chance to sort of review and renew our strategies locally. We developed health and wellbeing strategy, our climate emergency response, and our inclusive growth strategy at different times at Leeds City Council over the last few years. And this actually presents an opportunity for us to just look at all three and sort of renew and refresh, and then think about how actually the development of our thinking around addressing the climate emergency can feed into our forward plan around economic development. So I think that's a really positive aspect that comes out, and one of the challenges really is probably how we enter into a conversation about what that really means in practical terms, in terms of projects that we prioritise, and just reflecting on the types of capital projects or projects we invest in for recovery. traditionally we do lean to these large capital projects, and I'm not saying that those aren't important, but perhaps we also need to think about experimental projects that progress that the circular economy side of things, and looking at how we can create jobs in creative ways, and looking at some of the things that emerge around whether you can be generating projects in cities around, for example, food production that are addressing the climate emergency, creating jobs, etc.
Thank you very much. And that sadly brings us to the end of today's discussion. Once again, thank you to all the panelists for taking their time to be part of today's discussion, and for everyone who joined in.